Good morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm a minute late. I couldn't find the go live button. And of course, yeah, leave it to the person who does this and planned this. And I was a little bit late. So I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Let me know if you can hear me. Hopefully, everything is good on my end. But I'm excited to chat with you guys all about just all the things in the garden and in life and all the things. It's kind of a fun video just to get to just kind of spill all the things and give lots of different tips. I see some of you are close from Fresno. I'm in Exeter, Clovis, people all over upstate New York. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for listening. So I wanted to start off with first all the things that have gone really well in the summer garden. I know we're transitioning, well, I guess first day of August. Happy first day of August. We're kind of transitioning to that fall season, which is great. I love the fall garden. There's just so much to enjoy in the fall garden. But there's all kinds of things that went really well in the summer garden. But then personally, I feel like there's a lot of things that were difficult this summer. So we'll chat about all that. So one of the things that has went really well for us here personally in the Central Valley is that we've actually had a really mild summer. So last summer, it was in the 100+ degree temps basically every day of July. And this year, I think we've only had maybe a few days in the hundreds. And so it's been a really great summer. In fact, the other morning, my dad and I were going to gather cows. My dad has a cattle ranch as well. So that's another thing I do kind of behind the scenes that maybe you may have known about, maybe not. And as we were leaving the house, it was 59 degrees in July. So that was just insane and so incredible. And so things have been doing probably better than usual because we haven't had that really extreme heat. And if you're somewhere where you have had that really extreme heat, I totally get it because some years that's us. And so it's just really nice that we've had that really good weather. So that's definitely a plus. One of the other things is that my tomatoes are doing really great again. So there's lots of videos on the YouTube channel that you can watch about all my tomatoes, but I finally have got the soil really well out where the tomatoes are growing. And so one of the things that I just wanted to encourage any of you with is that if you have an area where you've been growing and it's just a struggle year after year, sometimes it just takes time. So I think it was five or six failed years of growing tomatoes in this specific area before I actually got a good crop. And now I look back to, excuse me, I look back to pictures of crops and I just remember thinking that every year I was failing, every year I must be doing something wrong. And then just one year, the tomatoes grew incredible. And so when you have really poor soil, one of the best things you can actually do is just grow something in that soil. And so when we actually started off, the soil was super high in nitrogen. It used to be a horse pasture. And from years and years of all the horse manure, you would want to say you think that's good, but too much nitrogen can actually be a bad thing. And so that first year we were growing tomatoes in this specific area, the tomato plants got huge, lots of leafy growth, but zero fruit. And then the next year, same thing. I think it was on the third season we finally got a tomato, but having those plants actually growing in that area was great to use up that nitrogen. So, it was too much nitrogen, not a good thing, but having the plants out there was actually great for using up that excess nitrogen. And then since then, for a couple years following, I didn't add any compost. I still just, I think it was still a super high amount of nitrogen. And so then finally, once plants started growing well, then I started adding a little layer of compost before planting time. And that's all I've done the last couple years. I have not fertilized. I haven't had to spray for bugs, nothing. And so I just see somebody from Ivanhoe, very close to me. Good morning. So anyways, that was like just a little bit of soil encouragement. And if you guys have questions on the soil, I would love to dive into that later. But let's see. A couple of the things I think that will lead a lot of my conversation today is on a exciting and stressful note is that my husband and I are finally building our forever home. And so not directly right behind me, but right to my left or that way, or whatever way you guys can see. We have our dirt house pad done and construction should hopefully start in 2 to 3 weeks, maybe, hopefully, if we're lucky. But it's been, if you've ever built, I'm sure you can relate, or if you haven't, it is a lot more than I thought it was going to be. Of course, that we were prepared for all of the steps and decisions and all the things, but just to actually get the construction part started has been a lot. And so I feel like to take care of our baby and the garden and the chickens and life and just all the things in general, and then to add this house thing on top, I am behind on so many things, which is why like there's been a decrease in videos and podcasts and just all this inconsistency in life that I don't like. I love to, stick to a plan, do my weekly things, and be very consistent for everybody that's following along. But that's been really hard this season. So as it comes to the garden, one of the funny things, which I guess this is why I wanted a video today, or a video that's more casual like today to share these things, because it's all of you showing up who probably have followed me for a while, is there are so many things I actually just didn't even plant in the summer garden. So each week I keep telling myself, okay, I'm going to plant a zucchini this week. Still haven't planted it, and we're on August 1st now. So I have tons of tomatoes and peppers, and that's basically it. I did plant a few cucumbers, and those are doing well. Um, and But none of my other summer veggies that usually are in the garden. And so it's not a bad thing because I feel like I just don't necessarily have the time for them. But it kind of makes me sad because I just have not planted all these crops that I really wanted to. And now it's already time for fall planting. So I probably will just continue to skip some of those crops and just go straight to the fall stuff. I guess since we're having coffee, we'll take some coffee breaks in between. But anyway, so I didn't plant a lot of summer crops, which kind of feels like a negative thing. But it also reminds me that I think that the garden we have seasons in the garden, we have seasons in life, and you just can't always do it all. And so I've been trying to think that recently, just the fact that I'm super excited that we're in the season of life getting to build a home, and it is a lot, mentally, and just to do all the things. For example, yesterday, I was able to get a babysitter, and I was at the coffee shop working on content for the Fall Garden Challenge, which is happening next week. I hope that you are signed up, and if you're not, I would love for you to join us. It's going to be a really fun week. I've actually never done this specific challenge. I have done similar events in the past, which have been incredible, but this one specifically is completely focused only on fall gardening, and it's 3 days long. And each day we're just going to we're going to start off with just understanding crops and how to pick different ones, planting times, etc. The next day we'll actually be creating the planting plan, and the third day will be preparing the garden to get those crops to the ground, basically. And so anyways, I was at the coffee shop getting some things finished up for that challenge, which is super excited. I'm super excited for, but it's nice to get out of the house because, as you know, if you have kids or just being at home, you get so distracted. And so, anyways, while I'm there working on things for the challenge, I get, a few emails from the person at the county, and then a call from this person and a call from that person, all house related. And the county has all these different holds on different people that have to approve, certain parts of our house plans right now. And they're telling me that they have sent them to the architect for him to send back whatever information they needed. Come to find out, they didn't send it to him. So it's just been sitting there all week with no notification, no calls letting us know that we're on hold, and we're just waiting for the building permit to be approved. And no one has gotten emails. At the end of the day, everything got sorted out a little bit, but it's just very frustrating. All these people that you have to deal with, and trying to stay focused is not easy. So anyways, but back to, I went on a total side tangent. So now I'm not realizing what I was going to say. Oh, I think just the fall challenge, the house building, and just kind of being scatterbrained. But it reminds me, life has seasons, the garden has seasons, but it makes me very excited for the fall season because there's just a lot less that you have to actually personally do. And so the weather gets cooler, crops grow a little bit slower. I think that's probably one of my favorite things with fall, is that versus something like a zucchini or a cucumber that gets so big so fast. I can't even tell you how many cucumbers I've picked this year that are like the size of little baseball bats because I missed a couple days, and then I just ended up feeding them to the chickens. And so I love that things grow fast, but it also means you have to harvest way more frequently. You have to be in the garden, much more often, and the weather's just not as enjoyable. So that's kind of the difficult part of the summer garden. But the fall garden most things can just kind of stay in the garden for quite a while. So when it comes to things like your root crops, so your carrots and potatoes and things like that, you don't have to pick them as soon as they're ripe. There are certain things that mature a little bit faster. So one thing that comes to mind would be radishes. So radishes are really quick to mature. Your little baby bell radishes or cherry bell. Sorry, maybe I'm thinking of baby bell cheese, I think. Cherry bell radishes, they usually are ready in about 25 to 30 days. And I have noticed with them, if you leave them too far beyond that, they do start getting a little bit tough and woody. But then there's certain things like your carrots, they can pretty much stay in the ground for sometimes a couple weeks, even a few weeks if the weather's still cool, past their time of maturity, and they're going to be just fine. Uh, and so, and then there's things like all your leafy greens. Obviously, depending on whether you're trying to harvest an actual head of lettuce or just baby greens, you can cut the baby greens when they're, a few inches tall, and you can continue harvesting a few times, usually off that same plant. If you're wanting to let that whole head of lettuce form, it's going to take a little bit longer to mature, but it's just such a slower pace. I think that's just one of the things I love, let alone just the weather that is so nice. And so anyways, if there is things that you have ever grown in the fall garden, I know I'm keeping an eye on the chat right now, but we'll do questions. I don't want to miss your question, so I will definitely get to questions at the end. But I will try to answer the ones that I see pop up. So I just saw a quick one come up that says, are there any quick maturing pumpkins? So the smaller the pumpkin itself is, the quicker it would be to mature. So right now in August, I wouldn't go for anything like your jack-o'-lantern type pumpkins or your big, pretty Cinderella pumpkins, things like that. Those do take a long time to mature, but your little tiny baby pumpkins, those really do mature fast because they are pretty little. So depending on where you are, if you are in zone 9, probably right now you should be able to still get them in the ground and get a harvest before it gets too cold. And potentially you might be able to grow a little bit bigger ones, but your sugar pumpkins, those little tiny, what are they? Just like the little mini tiny pumpkins. I can't think of the name, but let's see. This is my problem when I don't have like a list or a checklist to go through. There are so many things I want to chat about today. Oh, I think just some of the things that I have done to actually allow myself to have this garden in this busy season of life. And I don't know if we ever reach that point where we don't feel busy. I can't, you always, I feel probably a little bit behind, a little bit stressed and stretched. And so the things that have allowed me to grow this still really big, beautiful, productive garden, but not actually be out there every day is first that everything is set up on irrigation. And so I just have the, like your 1/2-inch black drip line, and then I have emitters at bigger plants. Once I put my fall garden in, I'll do probably the drip line or the T-tape, it's called, depending on where you get it from. But for crops that are closer together, like your lettuces, your carrots, things like that, I love to use like drip line that it just like emits because the plants are so close together. When it comes to something like a tomato or a pepper that's spaced farther apart, I like individual emitters because then you can adjust the water at each plant. If for some reason a plant dies midway through the season and you rip it out, that recently happened with a couple tomato plants, you can just turn that water off. So I have a bit of a different setup depending on the crop. However, everything is set up. I have not had to water by hand once this year. Everything's on a timer. Of course, I try to walk through about once a week when the water is actually running, just to make sure everything is turned on. Sometimes the emitters get clogged and you got to clean them out. But that just makes really all the difference. If I didn't have automated watering right now, there's absolutely no way I would have been able to grow a summer garden. And I also set all of that up. I'm trying 5 years ago, maybe. So, it was a one-time setup. I believe at the local irrigation store that we have, it maybe cost $100, if not less. And I'm including the cost of the timer. Well, actually, that's not true. Sorry. The irrigation supplies was probably about 50 to 70, and the timers are expensive. They're about two timers I have, they're about $40 each. But I purchased once, and now I've never had to be out there watering again. And so that's truly, truly the one thing. If if you don't do anything else, do that. Real quick, I saw somebody say that, how do you clean out the emitter? So I just take the little individual emitters, usually just a little piece of sand or something that gets stuck in there. So I just take like a little needle or a paper clip. They actually make like real little like poker things that you can clean them out with, but anything that just has a small little tip, like the size of like a paper clip or so, or a little, skinny needle. And you can usually just see the sand. And so I just, poke that sand. And then I see somebody say, how do you know when you've given your plants enough water? So I right now, and this varies, the amount of water you give really truly is dependent on your soil and your climate, so many things, right? But I have everything set up right now. Granted, everything is mature, so it's different at the beginning of the season. So let's just start, I guess, at the beginning. So at the beginning of the season, when my seedlings are really small, or say I just planted some seeds, I don't want to drown everything. And so I usually will I'll set my timer for 5 minutes daily, sometimes even 5 minutes every other day, depending on how cool it is and if the soil is actually staying moist. And typically, your seeds or your little tiny seedlings, either the seed is in the top layer of soil or the roots are in that top layer of soil. So you also want to make sure that top layer stays moist. So sometimes I'll even do 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the afternoon just to keep that top layer of soil consistently moist. And then as the as the plants start maturing, then I will increase how long I'm watering. So I might go up to like 7 minutes a day, and then maybe 10 minutes a day. And then I try to start spacing out my frequency. So deeper, or let's see, what's the right way to say it? Oh goodness, excuse me. Deeper watering more infrequently is ideal. So if you can get away with not actually having to water daily, and you can water every 2 to 3 days and water for a longer duration, that just your roots of your plants get deeper. And I get, depending on where you are, sometimes you really do have to water daily. I will say here, I think I have my timer set up right now for every other day, or to water on every third day. But we have had a pretty mild summer. And so I know that's kind of the roundabout way to get to it, but that's what you're kind of shooting for. You're hopefully getting to the point to where your plants are fine to be watered every few days versus daily. And you can get them on a schedule like that. Excuse me. You guys are the first people I've talked to today. So let's see, let's talk about watering a little bit. So then you also, having your mulch, and I guess these are just, all the things that you probably hear from gardeners all the time. Like everyone's just like, water this way and add mulch, and, they call it a day, but it sometimes doesn't really feel that simple. Like I know it's so much more complicated, especially if things aren't going well. But I guess what I was getting to is, if your plants, say you're watering every third day and your plants look fine, then you know that you're fine and you don't have to water more frequently. If you're watering every third day and by, noon your plants are wilted, that probably means you need to water for either a longer period of time or more frequently. So I just kind of base everything on how things look. With certain crops like tomatoes, for example, they really can go, they're such a big plant. So if you water for a longer period of time, more or less often, that really is ideal for the tomato plants. And they taste a little bit sweeter if you don't overwater. So if you give your tomatoes too much water, that could lead to the flavor just not being quite as good. They kind of get a little bit watered down. But of course, that doesn't mean you should underwater either. It's really it's kind of the hard balance, I guess. But let's see. One of the, I guess let's backtrack a little bit. So as we are on the topic of irrigation, one of the other things that I like to do is try to keep things in sections based on watering habits. So for example, my tomatoes are all on one specific line, and the timer that I have has 4 different zones. And so I have, I can water zone 1, for example, for an hour every third day if I wanted, and I can water zone 2 for 10 minutes every day. So it's really cool because you can specifically set up each zone. And I think I have the Orbit timer, which has 2 zones, and then the other brand, what is it? I forget, but there's not that there's not that many. You can look up, you know, watering timers with multiple zones. However, having the tomatoes on their own zone just means that I can then water them for longer periods of time, less frequently. And that's going to be different than, for example, what my squash and my cucumbers need. But I did mention I didn't plant any squash this year, so I haven't had that issue. But I do have actually lots of tomatillos and peppers, and I water them a little bit differently. I think it's a little bit less water. I run the tomatoes for longer. So I'm seeing real quick, and sorry if I have missed any of your guys' questions. Feel free to just I'll let you guys know when we're like at question time, I guess, at the end. And then if I missed it, just feel free to put it in the chat again. But the ones I'm seeing, I'm trying to get to. So the first one I'm seeing is, how do you keep the tomatoes from getting tough skins? And so sometimes I have noticed it is often the variety of tomatoes, but not always. But I have noticed certain varieties do have tougher skins. And so that's one thing. If you're noticing it on all of your tomatoes and you have various varieties, then it could be a watering thing. And that's where I guess more than even enough water, you just want consistent watering. So if you're watering by hand, it's very unlikely that the tomato plants are getting the same amount of water every time, because it's really hard to just, for me at least, like if I'm out there watering by hand, it just feels like it takes so long to truly give your plants the amount of water they need by hand. Is really going to take a lot of time, much more than you think. You don't want to just hold the hose for 2 minutes and let the ground get wet and then walk to the next plant. Ideally, you'd want to have that water hose on slow and let it really drip down to the root zone, and then maybe walk back through and do it again. So I'm just assuming, maybe you're watering by hand. And if you're not, that doesn't mean anything. But the point is, when it's set up on irrigation, where you have the little emitters running each day, they're getting the same amount of water every time. It's watering slow. The water is dripping into the soil slowly. And, which I have, a little, looks like a little like shower head, and it waters right at the base of each plant. But it's on for, 15 to 20 minutes every few days. And so they're just getting a really good soaking. And I haven't had any tough skin. So it's just, I think really the consistency of your watering, that really will play a big part. Sometimes if they're getting too much sun, that could kind of aid to tough skins, or at least sunburnt skin, which kind of ends up getting a little bit tough. Let's see if I can see any more. Okay, so then I see somebody say, what about rotating your crops? So I think, well, a few things, and I don't want to tell you wrong, but everybody has their own way. So I personally have not rotated my tomato crops ever. Well, that's not true. I used to grow them in a totally different area, but since I have been growing them where they are, I have not rotated them, and each year has only got better. I I amend the soil each season now with compost at the beginning of the season, and I cover the area with lots of mulch, and then all of that breaks down. But truly, if your soil is healthy and you're feeding your soil life by adding lots of organic matter, and you're putting compost down at the beginning of the season to give your crops the nutrients they need, I really don't think in a home garden that crop rotation is very necessary. I know people are going to talk about you have to rotate your crops to manage pests, but in a home garden, it really doesn't matter if you have tomatoes here one season and then 10 feet away the next year, because the pests, that's not far enough away to really make any bit of a difference. I understand if you actually have a current issue and it's with pests in your soil, or over when you had a really bad year with XYZ, then it would be smart to maybe move that crop to another bed the following year. But just the area where I have my tomatoes, I'm not moving that arch. We actually, the cattle panel arch that we set up, I've had it for 2 seasons now. It is so sturdy, so permanent the way we built it. And I wanted it for my tomatoes on all my vining crops. And so I'm not going to plant things in a different area. I'm just going to keep amending the soil, protecting the soil life, feeding the soil life. And in my opinion, or in my experience, every year has just only gotten better. So I'll say that about crop rotation. I know there's a few other gardeners I've talked to who are on the same page when it comes to a home garden. It's just such a different world than in ag. So if you're planting hundreds and hundreds of acres of corn, crop rotation or planting a different crop the next season, that's really beneficial because you're really using up all the nutrients in that soil. But it's just a lot different in a home garden, which is the nice thing. There's a lot of things that we don't have to do that you would do as a farmer. So I'm seeing okay, to keep the soil healthy, do you consider that when setting up the water? So Jennison, sorry, I might need to follow up on that question. So do you consider that when setting up the water? I think maybe you're just, maybe you're talking about rotating crops. Do I consider that when setting up the water? So I do, since I don't really rotate crops very often, I actually like my row where I have my tomatoes. They're just set up the same way every year. But I do in my raised beds. I guess that is one thing I would say. I don't rotate everything, and tomatoes are one of them. But I do end up with my raised beds switching things around every few seasons usually to kind of switch things up. So I might grow lettuce in, one raised bed one season, and then okra in a raised bed in the summer, and I switch things around. So with those ones, I've set it up to where I can actually detach my irrigation line, and then like I have the setup for that bed, for example, for the crops that go in there, and then I will just move that. I will like unscrew it and then put that in a different bed because say it was set up for lettuce, that's different than how it would be for okra. So I do kind of switch around the watering parts for different beds depending on which crops I'm growing. And so real quick, I do see you said, does compost tea work? And yes, compost tea is great. I personally haven't actually made compost tea, but I just use real compost and it breaks down. But compost tea is great too. Compost tea will be better for actually giving your plants like an immediate boost. But for your soil, I actually recommend just probably like a 2-inch layer of just actual finished compost, or it doesn't have to be fully broken down, but you do want it to have, broke down some before just adding it to your garden. But the point is, over time, that will just continue breaking down, and all the little microbes and all the things in the soil, they just kind of help turn that over into the soil. And as time goes on, it just breaks down. So the compost tea is kind of an immediate thing. Real compost is a slow, drawn out process, but it just continuously makes your soil better and better. And so, real quick, I see from Bruce, he says, do you have nematode issues in your tomatoes? I do not. But I was just recently talking with, I forget who it was, and they have been putting down beneficial nematodes every year at the beginning of the season and swear by it, and said it has been really, really helpful with the issues they were having. So you can buy beneficial nematodes and then you spread them out. I don't know if you do it. I don't know if you want to do it. You could probably do it now in fall, actually, once you rip out your plants, or you could do it in early spring. But I would look a little bit more into it. But I think that I would definitely try that. I've heard really good things about it, but I personally haven't had the issue to do that. Okay. And then Rika says, I found my first tomato hornworm yesterday. They've been eating all of my crops. Oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. So I will say they don't multiply super fast. One worm can do a lot of damage. So if you found it, just keep an eye out and just keep hand picking them off and getting rid of them. Or if you have chickens, feed them to your chickens. But they, hopefully once you pick a couple off, you'll be able to get them under control. So let's see. And then book designer, okay, how do you know when your compost is finished? Mine has been spinning since March, and it kind of has clods. In other words, it's not like soil. So if it's been already that long, I would just go ahead and use it. It's probably still clumpy. In time, it's just going to break down anyways. Sometimes sorry, let me start over. Depending on what's in it, if there's like, say you still see a banana peel, at this point, if it hasn't broken down since March, I would just get rid of it. Because if you were trying to make hot compost, which hot compost really needs to be like a big volume to start with to actually get up to temperature, that will break down a lot faster. If you're doing like a smaller compost pile and it doesn't ever get up to temperature, it's going to take a lot longer for things to break down. And so at that point, because you said it's been in there since March, I would just spread it out in your garden and it's going to just break down in your garden beds. But if you were to still see those big chunks of things, at that point, I would probably just pull them out. It's still going to be beneficial for your soil. But to truly get things to because you asked, when is it finished? Basically, you can say it's finished when all those big things that were in it now aren't. So, for example, I did a big compost pile with all the bedding for my chicken coop. So it was a mixture of straw and chicken poop. And then I had a bunch of leaves from mulched up leaves, grass clippings. I threw like some kitchen scraps, banana peels, apple peels, potato peels, things that were small chunks, nothing huge. And you get your big pile all at once. So I added everything to a huge pile. And anyways, sorry, I'm reading some comments. Harold, I see that you're taking off. Thanks for showing up, and sorry you couldn't understand. Anyhow, you start with this really big pile, and then within a couple days it starts heating up. I got a compost thermometer, compost thermometer, and then you can like watch, it gets up to a hot temperature, and then every few days you turn it. And I had a really great experience with that. Everything broke down really fast, and I was able to use it within a month or so in the garden. Well, maybe 2 months. Anyways, with that being said, it's just a huge pile, and you have to get it to heat, basically, to start everything breaking down. You have to turn it often. But if you are on a smaller scale, then I guess I think it just takes longer. And I haven't done a smaller scale compost, so there's that. But if you can get a big compost pile going, it is really fun to actually watch it get up to heat. Okay, let's see. And then Laura Lee says, I've been using coffee grounds in my compost. Is that wrong? No, not at all. I will say, depending on how much, depending on the volume, you don't want it to be basically all coffee grounds and not enough other materials. The more materials, an easy way, because I know compost is one of those things also that can feel super complicated. And I know for years I just didn't actually even get my own compost pile going because everybody I would talk to would talk about your browns and your greens and the nitrogen and carbon ratios and all these things. And they try to make this, what is actually a really simple thing, sound so complicated. And so my first compost pile that I did, I literally was measuring like perfectly all the different materials, layering it perfectly, and it worked great. It, instantly heated up like it's supposed to, but it was so much work. And I thought, if this is how much work it is to make compost, I'm not gonna make it again. And like I said, it worked great. And I had all these things measured out perfectly. Then I thought, well, if it worked that first time, with all these layers, the next time I do it, I'm just gonna kind of wing it and add lots of different things, but I'm not measuring anything. And so that was then the pile where I cleaned out the chicken coop. I threw everything into a pile, and I kind of I put it to the side, and I did kind of layer it. So I do some of the, stuff from the chicken coop, some scraps from the garden, some leaves, chicken poop and hay, and not hay, but the straw, the bedding. And I kind of layered it a little bit, and then you water it down, but nothing was measured. It was just kind of a little bit of everything. And that compost pile did actually even better. So I guess my point is, you can add lots of things in. You were asking about the coffee grounds. So if you have lots of other things, then that is great. If it's mostly coffee, then you want to get other things in there too. I think it takes a long time, but the coffee can change the acidity of your soil. So that's my only point of saying, you don't want it to just be basically only coffee grounds. You want other materials in there too. Okay, so let's see here. And then Candy says, do you cut plants off at the roots and leave them in there when the plant is done? And when you decide when the plant is done, when do you decide when the plant is done? I have peas that aren't producing like they used to, also tomatoes. So that is great questions. So that's one of the things actually that we're talking about on day 3 of the Fall Garden Challenge. And so for anybody here currently or watching this later, the link to the Fall Garden Challenge is in the description below. But we'll get into that right now. So yes, to your first question, when I'm done with a crop, I do just cut it off at the base of the soil. I will say if it's something, sometimes, for example, with a tomato plant, I will cut it off at, well, let me start over. Okay, there's all these like little tips that come to my mind. Okay, so if you have the space, so I'm just making up scenarios right here. For example, in my garden, where my tomatoes currently are, I don't plant any fall crops in that area because I have space elsewhere. And what I have found is I just let my tomatoes stay where they are and let them die back from the frost. And then they're a lot easier to manage and get rid of if you cut them off, if they're still green, and or just like right after the first frost when they first start getting damaged by the frost. If you try to cut them off at that point, they're still heavy and they're still so full of life that they're kind of hard to get rid of. So I let them completely die back. And then in like February, I let them pretty much go all the way through the winter. And then in February, at that point, then I will cut them right off at the base, and the plants are so much easier to move out of the garden at that point. But that's being if you have the space to do that. Okay. So if you don't have the space, then whenever you kind of have to get to the point where if you have room to have a couple things growing at once, then you can choose to say, leave your tomatoes and maybe plant some lettuce over here or some carrots. If you don't have the room, even if your tomatoes are still producing, then you have to decide, okay, well, I've got a few harvests for my tomatoes. I got to rip them out so that I can make a room for fall. And so that's all just kind of dependent on how much space you have. But I do cut things off at the base. Leaving the roots in the soil is great. That all the life in the dirt will eat at those roots, and it's great food for your soil, basically. If though you have like a really random humongous root, sometimes I don't like planting, like digging into humongous roots. So if it's all your little feeder roots, great, just leave those in the soil. But if you remove a tomato plant and there's a huge root, go ahead, that's fine to pull out of the soil because it's going to take a really long time to break down anyways. And so that's that part. And then you said, okay, let's try not to miss this stuff. Okay, so, and then you asked, when do you decide if the plant is done? So if it's not producing anymore, if you've already got, let's use a squash plant, for example. If you've already got a few harvests of squash and you don't see any more flowers, it's likely pretty much just done for the season. If it's full of flowers and full of little baby squashes, then you might decide to leave it till those ripen. But basically, I just judge if it's done or not, if it is or isn't producing. And you said you don't have tomatoes or peas producing like they used to. So your tomato plant could just kind of be done for the season if you've already got lots of harvest, depending on what variety you had. For example, determinate varieties, like Aroma, they usually produce a big crop, but then they kind of fizzle out. Something like an Early Girl or a Better Boy tomato, they should just continue producing basically till they get killed off by the frost. So it could have been the variety you were growing. And then you said peas aren't producing like they used to. So peas are a cool weather crop. So if they were producing in early spring, it's likely because the weather was cooler. But as it gets warmer, peas are going to stop producing because they are not a summer crop. But peas are a great fall crop. So I would definitely replant them in the fall. They are one of my favorites. Okay. I'm going to try to get to everyone's questions and go on tangents when I can. Okay. I have scarlet runner beans growing up a cattle panel trellis, but not seeing many beans. So let's see. Sometimes, depending on at what stage of growth they are in, sometimes they just take a while to mature. So your pole beans, the plant itself will grow, and it sometimes takes a while for those green beans to actually form. So I'm not sure how long they've been planted, but that could just be they might not have reached maturity yet. You'll see the plant will be grown way up the trellis before you'll start seeing those beans. And then let's see, mine is okay. And then I see that Tammy and Wood, you said that yours is in a rotating bin. So I've seen those, and I've talked to different gardeners. I have not personally used one of the rotating bins, but I think it's a good concept, but just depending on how much is in there, I've heard some gardeners say that they don't really like them. So I've had no problem just literally I just start the pile in the dirt out by the chicken coop. If you had, or even if you just had a bin or a section of your yard maybe. I just find that when you can just keep adding to it and then you just rotate it here and there, it seems to work really well. Okay, so let's see. Brianna says, I use sand for my chicken bedding, but sift out most of the sand when I'm cleaning it. Could I still use the chicken poop for my compost? Oh yes, absolutely. The chicken poop is great for the compost pile. Just note, chicken poop is high in nitrogen, and so you want to make sure it either fully breaks down, in your not fully, doesn't like have to be perfectly broken down, but you want to make sure it's been in the compost pile for a while so that it's aged before you add it to the garden, or it is pretty high in nitrogen. 1 second. Okay. Okay. Laura Lee says, since I live in a mobile home park, I can't plant anything in the ground. Is it okay to use potting soil? So, yeah. So I think you probably heard, you may or may not have heard me talk about this. So ideally, if you could have a raised beds are bigger. If you could get a mixture of topsoil and compost and then maybe even a little bit of potting soil, that is a much better mixture that I would recommend over just straight potting soil. The potting soil just drains really quickly. It dries out faster in the summer. And so it's not the ideal mixture. Potting soil is not actual true soil. It's made up of soilless things like your coconut corn, peat moss, and usually perlite, and all these things that make it really great for drainage, but it's hard in the summertime to grow crops in that kind of mixture. And so I guess so what I'm basically getting at is if you have an area where you could grow, in a bigger area, and you could get even if the raised bed is up off the ground, it won't be like quite as portable, but if you could fill it with a mixture of topsoil and compost, that would be great. But if you can only grow in little containers that are easy to move around, then potting soil really is your best bet, just because it's designed for containers. It's much more lightweight. You can move them around. But going into fall, the really great part is that fall is cooler and your container crops are going to do so much better. And so if you've ever had bad luck growing in the fall, if you've ever had bad luck growing in the spring or summer in a container, it was likely just because it's so warm. In the fall, the weather gets cooler and your container crops are going to do so much better. Okay, Allison says, what do I do to prepare my soil for my fall crops? So the only thing that I really do, Allison, is once if I have some summer crops growing in that area, I'll remove those crops before fall planting, and then I just spread a 1 to 2 inch layer of compost on top of that garden bed, and then that's basically it. So that compost will replace any nutrients that was used up over the season, and then your fall crops are ready. Let's see. Somebody says, so many bug issues, but I've had some wins with growing new beans, cowpeas, and Seminole pumpkin, some reaching over 6 pounds. Oh, that's awesome. So, well, sorry about the pest issues, but that is awesome that you're having such good luck with the pumpkins. Okay. Let's see. Many people use pots for growing vegetables. There is also the option of something like the garden tower with lots of different layers. Yes, definitely. You can, the garden tower, something like the, what's it called? The vertical, I can't think of which ones. I can't think of the common one that everyone uses, but yes, those are great. And especially for the fall with the cooler weather. So that's definitely a great option. Okay. And let's see. Karen says, thanks, Dennis, for they keep coming back. Is there a more long-term solution? I think we're talking about spraying. Okay. How do you handle whiteflies on cabbage and greens? Oh, sorry. I totally missed that question, Karen. I saw that. So one of the best thing is I see they're saying spraying them off with water, and I get that they're going to keep coming back. So right at planting, I don't know if this is already for this year or if you're, referring to last season, but if right at planting time, before you get the pest issues, if you just immediately cover those crops with insect netting. So I just got actually just a little kit on Amazon a couple years ago. I had just planted everything out in the garden, and my husband and I were getting ready to go on a trip, and I didn't want the pests to take over while we were gone. And so I just went on Amazon and I found the little hoops that you can set up and insect netting. And it's, of course, not the best setup, but it worked perfectly fine. And they came overnight with Prime. And so I just set those up. It was, just these little kind of tiny, cheap hoops, but they've lasted a few seasons. But basically what I'm saying is if right at planting time, you set that up and you put the insect netting and then you make sure it's well secured around the edges so the bugs can't get in, that immediately is going to really cut down on the issue. And so at planting time, if you haven't planted this year yet, that's what I would do right from the start, especially knowing that you have that issue, just to have a handle on it just right from the start. And that's the really cool thing about fall is that you don't have to let pollinators in. With your summer crops, if you have insect netting, when they start blooming, you have to open that up because the pollinators need to get to the flowers. But you don't have that for the fall crop, so that's a really great thing. Okay, and then Benjamin says, I don't make my own compost. What can I use instead? So totally fine if you don't make your own. In fact, some years I actually just don't have enough to put everywhere. So I would just purchase it at a local nursery or garden center if you can. Compost still really is your best option. So you can buy bagged compost. Sometimes you can find compost in bulk, but it is good to just be aware of where it's coming from. Sometimes a lot of your local landscaping companies put a lot of materials into the compost that actually aren't safe for the garden. Or if it's like the town waste management compost, you get a lot of trash and other stuff in the compost that just you don't want in your garden. So I have not personally been able to find a place that sells bulk compost, but if I'm short on it, I will just pick it up at the local nursery, or sometimes at Lowe's you can find composted chicken manure, which is really great. And I think it was always really cheap. It was about $5 a bag. So that would be what I would do if you can't make your own. So yeah, I was just talking about the waste management company. So yeah, sometimes I just would steer away from that because you never know what's in the compost. And a lot of times it's a lot of stuff that you just probably wouldn't want actually in your garden. Okay. And then somebody's asking, best way to manage nematodes and raised beds. So I was just talking a little bit about this earlier. So you can buy beneficial nematodes and you spread them out in the garden. I haven't done it, so I need to look up when you actually do it. But I want to say you can do it in fall, and you can do it again before spring planting. But that is what I've heard has been the most helpful and effective. So I would buy some beneficial nematodes, spread them out, and that's supposed to really make a big difference. And then somebody says, does shade cloth benefit cucumbers and tomatoes? Yes, especially if you have really hot summers, if you have the intense heat and sun, the shade cloth is definitely going to benefit them. You still want to make sure they're getting enough sun though, because if you add too much shade, then your plants are not going to flower properly. So if you could set it up to where they just get morning sun, maybe up until about noon, and then the rest of the day they would be shaded, that would be ideal versus having the shade cloth over top where it's shaded all day long. If you could set it up like at an angle where it gets the morning light, but then the shade in the afternoon, ideally that would be really great. Sometimes I know that's not possible. So then you want to make sure you could use like, 30% shade cloth. So enough sunlight still getting in there. But I know, I say that, and some people they actually have higher percentage of shade cloth just because their summer is so intense. So I kind of mess around with it. But then at this point in the year, it is going to start getting cooler. So you might be fine now. Okay, for a shade cloth, what percentage of the cloth would be good? And the cloths come in colors. What color would be best? So the white shade cloth I've heard is best. So I currently don't have shade cloth set up in my garden. Not to say I never will, but everything's done fine without it up till now. But white is best just because it's cooler. And I would start with, if you haven't used shade cloth, I would start with 30%, and maybe up to 40%. But more than that, then it's not letting enough light through, and your flowering plants need that light, or they need enough sunlight to flower. Okay, let's see. Next question. My experience with scarlet runner beans is that they flower, but they don't set beans in the heat. when the temperature comes down, they should set beans. Okay, that's really good to know. I have not personally grown that variety, and so that is good to know. Okay. Central Florida, when should I turn over beds for fall? So, Candy, by saying turn over, I'm assuming you mean turning over the soil. Not quite sure, or if you're just meaning when should you plant your beds for fall. But if your summer crops are, have basically, if they've produced and you're at the end of the season and you're happy with what you've gotten over the summer and you don't have room for your summer crops to keep growing alongside your fall crops, then I would start taking out your summer crops and getting everything ready so that you can plant your fall stuff. And in Florida, you also have, a very mild winter, so you can actually get fall things started even later, and they'll still keep growing longer into the winter just because you don't have, as harsh of a winter. So you could, with that being said, if things are still producing well, you could leave them in the garden a bit longer and keep getting a few more harvests off your summer crops. And then Laura Lee said, I had to put a shade curtain in front of my tomato plants because they were getting way too much sun, but they still get sun from the side, just not as much. Perfect. Yeah. Sometimes, it's great to, sometimes you have to block some of that. And so that's great. Chris says, how deep of a pot should I use for red cabbage? I want to grow on a covered patio under lights. Let's see. So it doesn't have to be very deep. In general, I just always say, sometimes I always say the bigger the container, the better, but that's in the fall, that doesn't matter as much because it's cooler. In the summer, the bigger the better, because then, it holds on to moisture a little bit better. For fall, I would say, I think cabbage roots only maybe get, maybe 8 inches deep. So I would probably try to go at least, 15 inches deep would be ideal. If it could be a little bit deeper, that would be probably great, but it doesn't have to be crazy deep. Probably, 12 inches at minimum, and you should be good. And I would say, I see that you said you wanted to put it under grow lights. If you have a spot, I don't know, how your porch is set up, but if it's getting enough sunlight, your winter crops don't need as much light as summer. So you might be able to get away without the lights, or maybe just turn on the lights for a couple hours a day. If it's in a spot where it still is getting some sunlight, you might not have to have the lights on always. Okay. And then that wasn't a comment to me. Okay. Well, awesome. Well, if you guys have more questions, I know that there were some questions that came on earlier in the chat that I didn't get to, and so feel free to post those again if I missed your questions. I'll get through a few more questions, but thank you guys for hanging out with me this morning. I kind of just went in all the directions, but it was fun getting to chat about all the things going on. Okay. How would you get rid of a leaf-footed squash bug? I have them invading my pomegranate trees. Oh. I wish I wasn't expecting you to say that they're invading the pomegranate tree. I don't know when I have them just in the garden, I try to just pick them off. And I've actually, which I know I hate when that's the advice that's given, because, it's not always that easy to just pick them off. I will say, if you can I did one year take the shop vac out to the garden and I vacuumed up them, and that really worked. It was, I was able to get a lot of them that way. So potentially, if you could try that did work in the garden when I had squash bugs. But if they're on the pomegranate tree, that could be a little tougher. But if you can find them in the garden, that could work. And the squash bugs are a tough one. They are hard to get rid of. Okay. It's been a very interesting, but I have to run. I have to core some apples to dehydrate. All right. See ya. Thank you. Okay. This was such a fun idea. Thanks for the coffee chat. Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for coming. I would actually love to do this more. Today, what's nice is my husband is actually off, so he's hanging out with our son this morning. But I was thinking on the mornings when he's at work, then I can just get up a little bit earlier and do it while my son is still sleeping. So anyways, I've been enjoying this a lot. Okay. Shawnee says, I've solarized a garden space, and today we are taking the tarp off to see how it did. I am planting transplants and direct sowing many things for fall. That's awesome. Well, I hope it all goes really well. If you have questions, I'm happy to hop into that. Okay. William says, how deep of a container is needed for tomatoes to do well? So tomatoes, great question. So tomatoes need, what is the, um, I had the, like, oh, ideally like a half wine, however big like a half wine barrel is, that would be like a perfect size for just one tomato. Because tomatoes truly get so big, they don't typically do that well in containers unless they're given plenty of space. So my mother-in-law, she has her tomatoes right now in half wine barrels, and she used to put 3 plants per wine barrel. They didn't do well at all, and I finally convinced her to just try planting 1 tomato per wine barrel, and this year she's had an incredible crop. So if you can get whatever that size would be, I think that's about 20 gallons of soil or so. 20, 25 maybe. If you could get containers that big, that would be ideal for you to actually have true success with tomatoes in containers. Okay, and then Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Okay, my cucumbers have not produced at all, but they are covered with flowers. I planted them a bit late, but they should have produced by now. Maybe the heat has slowed them down. Will they still produce? So if they have flowers, it could just be that they're not setting fruit right now in the extreme heat. I would, if you don't need the space for something else, I would just leave them in the garden, leave them, and you should still, because you can still even replant. For us in zone 9, and Michelle, I know you're in a warm climate just like me, you could still even replant your squashes and cucumbers right now and still get a harvest before the frost. So being that they are covered with flowers, I would just leave them and see if they ripen, in mid to late August. I think that they should. Okay, and then KV says, I'm able to do this because it is on YouTube instead of Zoom. Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that. I know on Zoom, well, there could be other issues, and I'm not the best tech person, even though that's my job is in doing all this tech stuff. But I couldn't even start my live this morning. But Zoom is, I guess, I think anyone can join Zoom even if you don't have the app. Potentially, I could be wrong. Okay, Dennis says, I have my tomatoes in 20-gallon grow bags, and they're doing great. Yes. Okay. Yeah. 20 gallons. I think, around the 20-gallon mark, I think is a good minimum. Smaller than that, I think tomatoes are going to struggle a little bit. Amy says, should I plant Brussels sprouts and broccoli now, direct sow, or wait? I'm in Eastern NC. I would start them in as seedlings right now. I wouldn't direct sow. So with your cool season crops, they don't love if the soil is too warm, germination could be an issue. So what I would do is I would start them in their own little containers, either indoors with grow lights, or if you have an outdoor shaded area, like basically like right where I'm sitting at right now, I have these tables that are under this tree, and I'm going to get all my seedlings started in this shady spot because it's just it's cooler. They get some sunlight, but it's out of the direct sun. And so I'm going to start all my seedlings out here. And then probably in late August, early September, then I'll transplant everything into the garden. So I would recommend the same for you. And then Michelle says, you'll try to be patient. Yeah, I would just, if you don't need the space for something else, I would just, I would just wait and hopefully they will produce. All right, everybody. Well, thank you all so very much. And if you're not signed up for the Fall Garden Challenge, be sure to do that. I will be going live all of next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And I would love to see all of you guys there. So all of you have a fabulous day, and hopefully we will have another coffee chat or evening chat soon. All right. Talk to you guys all soon. Bye.